Greetings, Clara Buckaroos and Buckarettes. In our discussion on mouthpieces, I think we left off and we were just about to talk about resistance in the mouthpiece. Now, we always have to remember when we're talking about any part of the mouthpiece that we remember that the mouthpiece itself is an integrated whole, so to speak, so that everything sort of influences everything else. But when we're talking about, say, resistance, we're talking about the primary areas that really will affect resistance. Just like the primary area that affects the core or the center of the sound is the sidewalls, the narrowness of the sidewalls. Well, when it comes to resistance, the facing of the mouthpiece is really the classicus locus of where you're going to find most of your influence on resistance. The mouthpiece facing, of course, is made up of a flat table, and then it's made up of two side rails and a tip rail. And the side rails, just as a little hint as far as its influence on resistance, the side rails are called the resistance curve, okay? And so that's where most of your resistance is going to be in terms of the way the reed functions on the facing, the resistance curve. And the longer resistance curves combined with closer tips are going to give you less resistance. And the shorter resistance curves combined with more open tips are going to give you more resistance. And if, let's for instance, you have a high resistance facing with a short curve and an open tip, then you're going to want low resistance reeds, like maybe a 2 or a 2.5 or somewhere in there, to fit on the mouthpiece. And the reason is that you want your reed strength and your facing resistance to combine together to be comfortable for you. So that's what you're going to be matching: open tips with lower resistance reeds, closer tips with higher resistance reeds. But you know, when you're playing, whether you're playing an open tip or a closer tip, once you pick the right reed, it's amazing how close they feel in terms of comfort. You do get some subtle differences in response and other things depending on whether it's open or closed, or whether the reed is low resistance or high resistance. But generally speaking, your goal either way is to get something that's nice and comfortable for you. Now, besides resistance, there's the issue of response, and that involves balancing the reed with the facing itself. And for that, without elaborating on it a lot, because I get a little frustrated talking about it, symmetrical mouthpieces are definitely the way to go. Again, without elaborating on it too much, it's much easier to balance reeds on symmetrical facing mouthpieces. If you don't know what I'm talking about, some people produce mouthpieces that have crooked rails. In other words, you have two resistance curves on the mouthpiece, not one. One curve is longer and slower, the other curve is shorter. And this complicates reed balance and complicates controlling the reed at the different pitch levels and dynamic levels and getting clarity out of the sound, out of the tone. It complicates it considerably and makes you work much harder behind your nose. In fact, it forces you to create bad habits like biting and making all kinds of changes in order to secure response. All that stuff goes away. 95% of it goes away with a well-balanced reed on a beautifully finished symmetrical mouthpiece facing. So without saying any more, I'll leave it at that. And I know that some people are saying, well, I'm playing a crooked mouthpiece and I really like it. Well, that's really fine. But maybe if you actually played a well-balanced reed on a beautiful symmetrical mouthpiece, played it for a little while, you would realize just how hard you're working and how much you're frustrated in not being able to find reeds and just to look for reeds and fit the reeds crooked on the mouthpiece to get them sort of that they'll respond and produce a clear sound. Okay, I'm elaborating. I said I wasn't going to do that, but believe me, I know what I'm talking about. You'll be a much happier camper playing beautifully finished symmetrical mouthpieces, much happier to have many more reeds and play with a lot more ease and a lot more security the full pitch and dynamic range of the clarinet. And that's, after all, in fitting reeds and mouthpieces, that's the kind of sine qua non, right? Okay, having said that, let's go on to our next subject, which is, you might say, kind of miscellaneous stuff. Well, when it comes to miscellaneous stuff, I think that probably the best place to start is the beak and the beak slope. I'm sure that you've noticed that when you look at different brands of mouthpieces, different styles of mouthpieces, that you'll find that beak slopes will be shorter or longer than other beak slopes. There'll be, more acute angles and so on and so forth. But when you look down the mouth, when you look down the beak from the tip of the mouthpiece, and you look closely, you'll see that the radiuses of the beaks are also quite different. Some are flatter, and some have much more of an arc. So, what's my point? My point is that the amount of material there is in the beak, how thick it is in the center, how balanced it is in thickness from the center to the edge, all these things have really an objective effect on the sound, but we are going to experience that mostly subjectively. I think if we want to draw a principle out of this, we'd have to say that the thinner the beaks are, that is, the less material there is, the more resonance there's going to be, but the more brightness there's going to be in the sound. And the thicker, the more stable, and the more stability there will be in the sound, and also the highs will be damped quite a bit. Now, if you're taking a mouthpiece and you look again right down the tip of the mouthpiece, you'll notice that at the very edge of the tip, where the tip rail ends, the very end of the mouthpiece, you'll notice that the beak it'll be thicker in some mouthpieces and thinner in others. Now, I'm not going to say that there's an absolute measurement here, but I will say this. If you get a mouthpiece when you're looking at the tip of it and it's very, very thin at the very tip, that's going to be a really bright mouthpiece. Everything else could be perfect in the mouthpiece. The facing could be perfect. The bore and the chamber and could be a work of art. And if you thin that beak out too much and the very tip itself is thinned out way too much, when you hit the notes above the staff and you start to push the dynamic, it's going to sound like a nail being scratched across a blackboard. It's really you can ruin the mouthpiece by simply machining the tip incorrectly or machining too much material out of the tip. So those are some tips about how to look at the mouthpiece in terms of the beak slope, beak thickness, beak thinness, and radius and all that. All those things come into play and will affect the way the clarinet mouthpiece responds, and moreover, how stable it is and how it sounds. And of course, you don't want a dead sound, but you certainly don't want that beak slope to be creating all kinds of very harsh overtones that are really hard for you to listen to, not to mention other people. Another thing about the mouthpiece that has some influence on the damping of the sound, the darkness or the resonance or response of the sound, is the barrel of the mouthpiece. That's the major part where the ligature fits. Some barrels, of course, have different angles, different tapers, and there are also different thicknesses. Some, as you notice, that the same ligature doesn't fit the same on every mouthpiece. Usually, the more material there is in the barrel of the mouthpiece, the more damping and more darkness there will be in the sound, the more damping of the highs. And the damping of the highs are the things you really have to concern yourself about, mostly about in the high dynamic levels, when you're hitting high dynamic levels. Same way with the thinness of the beak. When you start to push the dynamic and you're above the staff, that's when you're going to see those really ugly things start coming in to the recipe of the overtones. So those are some other things, and the final thing, I guess, could be the debate about materials. And I'll say this, that if if a maker knows the materials, then the maker can create almost anything that he or she wants with the material they're working with, in terms of producing good sound, good tone, and good tuning and all that. The dimensions have to be right, but beyond that, if a material happens to be lighter or softer or this or that, it's going to have an influence on the response and the overtones, the harmonics that you're going to get out of that material. And you can adjust the material so that you can make it sound darker or brighter or whatever, just like you can take a hard rubber mouthpiece and machine it, say machine the Beak so it's real thin. You can ruin it like that. You can also take a plastic mouthpiece or an acrylic mouthpiece or a soapstone mouthpiece or whatever mouthpiece you want to make, and you can create much of those same responsive and coloristic characteristics by just the way you proportion the mass in the mouthpiece itself. That just takes intelligent design. Generally speaking, most of us play hard rubber mouthpieces because that's what we've been given mostly. But the fact is that with different materials, you can get very analogous playing characteristics. It's just a matter of intelligent design. And so I think that sort of sums up the things that we could generally talk about. The main thing is, when you're going to test a mouthpiece, just don't test it on one or two features. Run the mouthpiece through several tests. Do the pitch test. Listen for stability. Listen for response. Examine the facing. Examine the beak slope. Test it at different dynamic levels. And above all, test the tuning and make sure that the mouthpiece, in my opinion, the mouthpiece really has got to have a symmetrical facing. A lot of clarinet players have ruined their whole careers by playing crooked mouthpieces and struggled, and then pass those errors on to their own students. Don't do that. Okay, whatever. So anyway, that's our summary on the mouthpiece, and I will wait for the onslaught of your vituperations. And with that, I'll say thanks for listening. We at Ridenour Clarinet Products produce these videos to help educate players and educators about the clarinet and clarinet equipment. If you've been helped by this and or other RCP video presentations, please subscribe and be sure to share them with your friends and teachers. Also, visit us on the World Wide Web at www.ridenourclarinetproducts.com. Thanks for listening.